Much for attending. Thank you very much for attending this OnSeminar, the first of a full range. It's an honor to present this, and I hope that, of course, with the increasing attention and emphasis on energy storage in the energy transition, these insights from IEA TCP will help you also in your work. I would like to give my presentation with a focus on the more generic aspects of our TCP, on energy storage in general, why it's become so important lately over the past few years. And of course, I will highlight later on also in the presentation the specific role of energy storage TCP it plays in the research and development context. The following, let me see. The following issues I will address. Why we need energy storage. I think that's an important part to discuss because everything is changing with regard to energy system. The essentials of energy storage, the challenges we have to face with energy storage, and I'll elaborate a bit on the energy storage technology collaboration program, while Thibaut will later on discuss more about the IEA perspectives on energy storage. Why we need energy storage? I think that's a big question because it's been since a long time that we have a lot of emphasis on renewable energy production or energy savings, but the current situation is definitely changing the situation with regard to the big energy transition. What we currently face is that the decarbonization of the energy production means going from fossils to renewables implies also that we have to face a situation where renewables also have a volatile production profile. That being said, is an important thing because we have to balance that with the load patterns we also have to face. The second point is that in this whole transition process, we see that electricity moves basically to the heart of the energy system. Electricity production and also electricity use is increasing. We see a lot of the transformation processes, for instance, in the mobility sector, electrical vehicles, or in heating, where oil, coal, and gas being shifted to electricity or heat pumps. Also in the industry, where fossil fuel-based process heat is being replaced by electrification. All these developments bring electricity more into a focus area of the transition. We also see that there's a higher level of interaction between the various sectors. You have to be sure that we have to place the right form of energy at the right place and time. Again, look at how heating and mobility have an impact of this changing profiles. And in this whole perspective, we see that energy storage gains in value, economic value, but also value to make the overall energy system more reliable, more precise, and more, let's say, safe in the future. And of course, these developments, they create a public interest also from political points of view. Well, if you basically look at how these changes take shape, in the past, if you look at the small circle where production and consumption basically were connected directly, if we needed more consumption, we needed more energy in whatever form, the decentralized way we had in our previous energy system, fossil fuel based, we could just increase our production rate and tune that to the consumption. With the introduction of renewables, decentral and central renewables, there's a whole new spectrum. We have wind, hydro, large solar, bioenergy, all these renewable energy forms, and the fact that we have what we call presumification, producing renewables the same time, the same location that you can use them, but maybe not at the same time. So energy storage takes shape. And of course, there's a lot of data involved in order to connect these, and it works also within a new and intelligent grid environment. This changes in the energy system requires a totally new approach how we can basically make steps forward, and requires far more flexibility. So from an old model where we have a constant supply meeting the various demand profiles, we change to a fluctuating supply from renewable sources. And that requires that at the same time, when we have also changes in our demand profiles, storage and flexibility become extremely important in order to balance the whole system and to make sure that we provide energy at the right time, at the right place, and in the right shape and in the right capacity. These kind of changes definitely will not be able without more flexibility and without more energy storage. I mentioned already the interaction between the sectors. That is a very important element now if you look at the entire system. It is not one-to-one that we can provide energy to a certain application, like mobility or like heating or like industrial process energy. We far more independency see occurring between fossil fuels replaced by renewables, where for instance, electricity can be used both for mobility or for heating or for your normal electricity production or consumption in the industry or in your home. At the same time, we can produce locally. All these various changes and the coupling of the various demand sectors requires energy storage as an intermediate enabling technology in order to meet these changing load profiles and in the various sectors. And that's why energy storage becomes a very crucial part in any new process. So basically, the flexible sector coupling with storage requires that electricity, if we see that as the main commodity for a lot of the new processes, can go through either thermal storage and then be used for heat and cold, or directly, of course. And the same goes for mobility. And gas fuel from electricity, the so-called power to molecules of power to gas route, may also be supporting the consumption patterns in mobility and heat and cold. This is just an example how this can develop in and need energy storage as an intermediate technology to make that happen. Finally, the politics and the policy need to be able to encourage the use of storage is also internationally growing. There is an understanding which hasn't been there for a long period that energy storage is and needs to be taken into account in order to make the transition to a new energy system based on renewables. That is an important consideration, because if the politics and the regulation connected to the politics don't take that into account, we still see that the value of energy storage will be too limited. And that brings us to the point that economics are very important. The economic value of energy storage depends, of course, on the application it's being used, but it is definitely increasing at the moment, because the fact that if we don't use energy storage, for instance, as an example, well, by increasing the electricity infrastructure instead, if you want to produce more variable renewables and bring that to your consumer profiles, you can do that also by increasing your infrastructure, by avoiding that through the use of storages. It is a very economic, interesting aspect. For instance, we see now that solar parks or wind parks will not be able to be connected because of the limitations of the electricity grid. By using electrical storage on site of the production, you could be able sometimes to reduce the electricity grid by up to 60–70%, if that's up to 36% remaining, which is a huge economic value for the grid operators. So the economic value increases, but it also have to be look into the various changes in the application. A kilowatt hour of a cell phone battery costs enormous amount of money in terms of storage capacity. If you compare it to the, for instance, the storage capacity for hot water or for heating, that's a definitely big change. So always look at the application you want to achieve and see how that could have an economic impact on the overall system situation. Well, if we look at the essentials of energy storage, storage is just a very basic charging, storing, discharging cycle. A process where we, let's say, include the time parameter into the, let's say, the direct normal production to consumer level. By introducing storage, you can change the time frame of the production to the load. That is the essence of storage. And by charging and discharging and having that in a certain cycle, this is a major part of the storage principles. So you have to look also to, with storage, the physical parameters. There's a need for storage in many forms, in many shapes. In terms of the capacity, what do you actually require? What is the time span in using the storages? Is that a year? Is that a second? Or is that a month? Or an hour? Or a day? That fully depends on the kind of application, and also depends on the kind of commodity you like to store. The desired charging and discharging capacity, how fast it should go. It should be fine-tuned to the certain load you want to achieve. And it has, of course, the dependency. What do you want to store? Is it electricity? Is it renewably molecules produced by renewables? Or is it heat or cold in any form? Basically, by fine-tuning the storage dimensions and parameters on your application, it defines the way you can actually see how storages will develop. If you look at the classification of storage, there is, of course, we distinguish basically three categories. It is the power to power, and basically there's all the electrical and mechanical storages you can do, and they can be in various forms and shapes. You have batteries and all kinds of sorts, and we have flywheels, and there's compressed air. There's a lot of applications connected to the power to power way of using storage. On the other side of the spectrum, we see heat and cold as a storage medium. Basically distinguish between sensible, latent, and thermochemical heat or cold. And it can also be done in all kinds of forms. It can be water, solid liquids, or molten salts, or PCMs. There's a lot of various shapes of energy storage. And of course, the power to gas route, where we let's say transfer basically electricity to hydrogen or power to gas. That is also one of the elements we simply can use energy storage for other use and applications. So if you want to compress it, thermal, it's of course a very relatively inexpensive way to store energy. I think we've seen it applicable and used for centuries in many ways and shapes in the buildings and the industry, from passive storages in buildings, used already with the old civilizations, to very new and innovative new forms of thermochemical energy storage, thermal energy storage. It has a very low access rate to the consumer, which I think is very important. With regard to chemical storages, of course, it is super because it has a high energy density, like fossil fuels also have a huge energy density. It can basically be stored for a long term, can be transported, which is important. But you have to understand also that if you want to produce these chemicals by renewables, it is a very or fairly expensive form of storing energy. but it can be used in applications, for instance, where we don't see any alternatives, like the aviation or the shipping or other applications. Electricity, of course, that is a very commonly used form of energy storage. You don't need transformation from one commodity to another. It's normally very efficient, could have high power output, and of course can be transportable if you put it in the kind of a transportable containers. So these three categories of energy storage are mainly dominating our agenda. If we look at the challenges, what is the innovative challenges we have to look for if we work on the further development of energy storages? Technically, we want to optimize the grid infrastructure, because if you want to make the connection between supply and demand based on volatile energy production, we have to look how we can optimize the grid. But just increasing the grid capacity, that is not a feasible answer to the energy transition. So we have to anticipate on demand response, bidirectional communication and energy flows, like for instance, bidirectional use of batteries in cars, load and discharge with connected maybe to household situations. There's huge opportunities with regard to IoT and artificial intelligence if we want to use all the data available in order to optimize energy storage within the context of a system. For instance, in combination with flexible sector coupling. And of course, there's overarching technical challenges all the time to look at safety, compactness, low cost, reliability, durability, etc. So there's a whole range of technical challenges we have to look into when we work on further development of energy storage within our TCP. Also economic challenges. There has been a very low interest in storage in the past because there was not a real need to implement storages. At the moment that we see now that there is an economic value connected to energy storage, that gives a totally new perspective of how we optimize and implement energy storage. So it has an impact, for instance, on the asset value of the energy grid. It can be used to maximize or optimize the energy, renewable energy production by combine, for instance, a solar or a wind farm with energy storage to reach the highest price level or to reduce the cost of infrastructure. It has enormous impact on the development of decentralized energy systems. And of course, all this requires also not only an economic evaluation, but also to transform that into a updated regulatory framework. So now, last part of my presentation, a few words on the IEA energy storage TCP. It's a lot of jargon. TCP stands for Technology Collaboration Program, and it is one of the instruments the IEA is using in order to boost the innovation in certain technologies. The energy storage TCP was originally started in 1979. So there's a long history of development and research with regard to energy storage since basically the 80s of the last century. Today, 21 countries participate in the work of our TCP with more than 100 experts working in various tasks, which we will discuss later. It will anticipate on the energy transformation, which I hope described in the first part of the presentation. And of course, we cooperate very strongly with other organizations and TCPs, also with Mission Innovation and other international platforms. And of course, it is important that we bring this together within the framework of the IEA, because a lot of other technologies are being developed in the same way, but energy storage in particular is a very sincere enabling technology which supports the use of other renewables and other technologies. Our mission is to contribute to the transition towards renewable energy systems-based energy system. And we do that with joint research, design and development, and also pre-standardization work. We try to disseminate the results as good as possible. We'll refer to the website in a minute. Include the industry, because industry is in many cases the launching customer to really start using and deploying energy storage. And of course, we look at the entire system, because you can look to the energy storage as a component, but it also needs to be taken into a total holistic system approach. With regard to our scope, we look to compact, safe, and affordable storage systems, both for heat and electricity, in both central and decentralized systems. We have very much a focus on integral solutions. So from production, storage to load, basically those, let's say the chain of the energy flows from production to the use. And of course, it has a lot of impact on the other technologies connected to the energy transition, like the production of renewables, heat pumps, district heating, cooling, energy conservation, etc. Today, or let's say in the past 2 years, we have developed a new strategic plan with some priorities. Our research priorities basically can be defined in 4 areas. On the thermal storages, we look at underground storage systems, and that's basically for the longer term periods for certain applications, particularly for the built environment and industry. We also look at compactness. If we can make thermal storages far more compact, for instance, the use of water or these kinds of liquids, it has definitely benefits for the application. And of course, it need to be integrated solutions combining, for instance, heat pumps and energy storage will make it far more easy to be able to be used in households or industries. We look at thermochemical materials, phase change materials, PCMs, sensible heat and cold storages. So basically the whole range of energy storages are being researched within the energy storage TCP. With regard to electrical storage, there's a high emphasis on grid integration aspects and the way storage can be used in electrical mobility and basically in all kinds of energy systems. The development of electrical energy storage in itself has not the highest priority, because a lot of these storages are in a kind of competitive mode where industries develop their own electrical storages. But implementing and deploying them within a system context is extremely important, and that's one of our focus areas. With regard to the hybrid options, we call them the power to heat, the power to gas, as carriers to serve as a flexible and commodity for energy stored for all kinds of application. That is, of course, one of the issues we look at. And finally, the modeling. If you want to calculate the right energy storage within a certain application, we have found that there's a lot more work needed in order to improve the position of energy storage in many of the calculation models we see, and also in the economic models. Of course, that has to do also with the coupling, the sector coupling, and the way we can provide flexible solutions in energy systems. The way we conduct our work in the energy storage TCP is by what we call creating tasks. And the task is basically a subject where a number of countries and experts in those countries and institutes and universities and companies work together in order to bring, let's say, the subject to a better and a larger stage. In particular, we have tasks which run maybe in a period of 2 to 5 years. And in this sheet, you see a number of these energy storage tasks. There is one sector where we look at energy storage in energy systems. And the tasks we done there are on, for instance, modeling or flexible sector coupling, or smart design and control, where we use and look at artificial intelligence of energy storages in a system. How we can deploy large storages for thermal heat in district heating, or for instance, how we could assess the economic parts of the thermal energy storage in the overall systems. So that's a whole range of tasks where typically between 5 and 15 institutes or countries work together to bring the state of the art, let's say, a huge jump forward in the further development. With regard to materials and components, we have a very interesting, let's say, long-running task on how we can make more compact thermal energy storages, where we look at materials and components within systems, where we can concentrate there on PCMs and thermochemical storages. And we do that in conjunction with other TCPs as well. But there's also a whole range of tasks dealing with the technology improvements of the storage system itself. Like we have an interesting task where we combine a heat pump and the energy storage in a kind of a black box concept where we have one integrated system. Or we work on Carnot batteries, a very inexpensive and site-independent storage for electrical energy. We also look in the task at ground source de-icing, on how we can use the energy storage in the underground for de-icing purposes in northern climate countries. And of course, we will start a new task on medium duration energy storage. There's a lot of work being done on the long term or on the short term, but the medium term is an important area we need to focus on and concentrate on. Apart from this, our technical work, we also organize, let's say, a scientific conference, the NSJAC conference, NSTAC conference we do every 3 years. There will be an intermediate online version starting in 2023, which is good to have an update on all the scientific work being done within the scope, within and outside the scope of the energy storage TCP. We have started the initiative to create an energy storage database for people to find the right information and documentation of successful storage systems and applications. We'll launch this later in this year. And of course, we continue to promote a scientific exchange through experts and knowledge by webinars, symposia, and these kind of activities we see today with this online seminar. I'd like to invite you also to visit our website, look at it and find information. Please also send some feedback if you like, and there's a newsletter you can sign up to be informed on the latest developments. And with this, I thank you for this overview, for listening to us, and I hope you'll be involved and participating in any of our activities over the next period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very nice insights. So we can start with questions if there are some. Yes, I see there are some. No? So just raise the hand. Yes, please. Bernard Welly, go ahead, you can ask the question.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So what would be interesting to know, how do you relate to other initiatives, for example, the important projects of common European interest, like the IPCEI for batteries? Because, I mean, batteries are some kind of energy storage, even though you are more holistic in that view. But do you have any connection points, direct connection points, or how do you relate to them?
To which one in particular, Bernard?
To the important project on batteries.
Battery development, yes. Well, at this point in time, we don't have specific activities on the battery development itself, apart from, let's say, the Carnot battery task, which deals with a lot of the, let's say, the larger kind of battery development. We found that the developments in the battery industry is very, very competitive and very commercial by industries. And there seems to be not so much an interest of sharing international scientific research results. That is the core of our activity. We definitely need to find subjects where there's an open mind to develop together with various institutes within countries to develop the technology to a better stage, to a new stage. If there's too much commercial or competitive issues around a certain development, companies typically want to keep the information to themselves. So that's sometimes a hurdle if we look at particularly the battery development. But for instance, for many other developments, we see this openness with scientific institutes to work together to bring the technology further, and that basically helps us.
Okay. So many thanks. Is there any further question? Yes, please. Harald, go ahead.
I would give a comment maybe, or maybe you can also say something about it. You said at some point that, I think you said that people until now have not been aware of the importance of energy storage. And I think this is not because it was not important. I think it's just because where it is, we are simply used to it and we don't take notice of it. And the typical example that I use is from my first project with the ZAE, and that was domestic hot water. If you open the faucet at full flow, which is I think 10 liters per minute, it's equivalent to 20 kilowatts of power. If you would like to do that electrically, that would be 7 outlets that you have to put together. And you would probably never install an electric battery that can supply 20 kilowatts in your house. It's damn expensive. And this is the domestic hot water storage is completely well known and widespread, but the people are simply not aware that we already have energy storage in all our houses, and that it's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, that's a good point, Harold, you mentioned there. I think there's many ways we use storage already in the past, and I think it always has been determined by the fact that it is economical or it provides comfort, like your hot water storages. It has far more comfortable situation than by having instantaneous heaters. So that's fully correct, your observation. I think what I mentioned with my remark is that with the transition, and we have to face on the larger scale, in particular with change also to more electricity, we see that there's a lot of new economic interest on the use of energy storage. For instance, to make, let's say, the infrastructure affordable and keep that into mind. So we see a growth in economic applications, and that helps. And that's why I think it's increasing the interest. But you're absolutely right that there has been a lot of very good examples of storage in the past. That's a good addition.
Many thanks for this. I would say the next question, please, from Saman Gunasekara, and then I would like to start with the next talk in order to stay in time. But please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. Regarding thermal energy storage, mainly my question, I see that in your list of partnering or interested countries, there's China, but regarding different task activities that I've been participating, I didn't see China participating. Would like to see your comments on it. Are they going to be joining ECS or?
If I understand you correctly, you asked whether if China is also participating in research projects. That's the case. Not in all tasks, but in some of the tasks they are participating. And of course, they can. It's open to all the participating countries. The 21 countries can participate in any of the tasks.
That's nice to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
So many thanks and nice questions, I think. With this, I would ask Thibaut to start his talk, and we can move directly forward.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Well, thanks, Stephanie. I'm pleased to follow up on Teun's presentation to put things in perspective and highlight the role of energy storage in the transition to net zero. When we think of net zero emissions technologies, the first that come to mind are certainly a solar panel, an electric vehicle, perhaps a heat pump. But increasingly, we are realizing that those individual technologies could only work at scale as part of a system. And they need to intelligently exchange energy, information, data in integrated smart networks. And to build such a system, we need storage, increasingly more as the energy system decarbonizes. One of the key underlying trends for this observation is that variable renewables lead the way to net zero. Here you have a picture of global electricity supply in the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, where you see a rise in total electricity generation. And today, 60% of this electricity is supplied by fossil fuels without CCUS. But this goes to zero in 2040, where the electricity system is decarbonized. It's getting replaced by fossil fuels with carbon capture, hydrogen-based solutions, nuclear, but most importantly, 90% of electricity generation in 2050 is propelled by renewables, hydro, other renewables, solar PV and wind. And especially solar PV and wind contribute to nearly 70% of total electricity supply at the global level in 2050. So this means a lot of variability in the supply. New challenges are emerging from this decarbonization trend. And we can see this by doing a deep dive on, for example, G7 countries, but the same could apply to many, many countries in the world, where the share today of solar PV and wind variable renewables typically ranges from 6% to 30%. It means that we are still in the first phases of renewable integration, from phase 1, system integration being not a relevant issue with a very low share of variable renewables, to phase 3, which would be that we need some flexibility investments, but that are affordable in different measures. But as we are moving towards 2030, 40, and 50 in the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, the growing share of solar PV and wind makes us reach the following phases. By 2030, all countries in the G7 reach phase 4, which requires advanced technologies to accommodate for this variability in supply and in demand. And by 2050, all countries are either in phase 5 or in phase 6, where we need to ensure energy security, even with frequent periods of wind and solar PV that are exceeding demand or are falling short of meeting the demand depending on weather conditions and other parameters that influence their production. Another point is that when we talk about flexibility and matching renewable supply with demand at any point in time, we mean different things. First, we can mean, for example, meeting peak capacity, for which we see in this example of China, storage could play a strong role. Today in 2020, the peak power demand is largely met by unabated thermal power plants, but in 2060, more than a third of the peak demand is actually met through storage solution in China in the scenario which reaches net zero emissions by 2060 in this case. We also have a need for enhanced stability and ramping flexibility. That is the ability of the power system and the demand system to adjust very rapidly to changes in variable renewable output or to changes in demand below the minute, for example, or below the hour, depending on the situation. That is to say that we have a variety of energy balancing challenges, not only depending on the time horizons, but also depending on the nature of the service that needs to be provided, whether it's heat, whether it's electricity, whether it's gas, as Teun mentioned before. And this requires a diversity of storage solutions. The first that come to mind is, of course, grid batteries, which are at the heart of modern energy security. Here you have a picture of the hour-to-hour adjustment needs in the power systems due to the variability in supply. So you can see here in 2018, two examples from the European Union and the India, where we have an hour-to-hour adjustment of 20% and 10% upwards. And if we keep adding this to have a picture of the recent trends, we can see that this adjustment is contained between plus or minus 15% from 1 hour to the other. But as we move to the future, to 2040, with increasing share of variable renewable, we see that this range is expanding quickly and especially exceeding plus or minus 25%. So this means new capacities, new storage capacities to actually accommodate for this variability. We mentioned grid batteries, but of course we have other solutions that might be more cost effective and reduce the need for upgrading the infrastructure. I'm thinking, for example, of EV batteries. EVs, electric vehicles, the stock will increase dramatically in the coming decade and through to 2050. This doesn't depend on the scenario. What depends on the scenario is, of course, the steepness at which this rise will occur. Here in the sustainable development scenario, for example, we have more than 200 electric vehicles on the road in 2030, and that's as much batteries that could be used to provide some services to the energy system, especially through passenger light-duty vehicles, battery electric vehicles, which represent nearly 150 million vehicles on the road to 2030. But the question is, we try to quantify how much of this flexibility potential could actually be used, and what would be the implications on the energy system. Does it really make a difference or not? And for this, we tried to analyze what's the peak capacity and what's the off-peak capacity requirements in different regions in 2030 with an EV deployment corresponding to the one we had in the sustainable development scenario. So we have a big gap between the off-peak capacity needs and the peak capacity needs, which needs to be addressed through storage or through additional capacity that will just be used for 10% of the time. But with the EV fleet and assuming a relatively good participation rate, we see that we can almost completely offset this gap between off-peak capacity requirements and peak capacity requirements as EVs through vehicle to grid, so discharging electricity to the grid, could unlock 600 gigawatts of flexible capacity distributed across the main EV markets. 600 gigawatts, it's absolutely enormous. It represents nearly half of the current hydropower capacity today. Not all of this will certainly be tapped into. That's really the upper potential. But it's just to say that there is an underlying big storage capacity in the EV fleet, which governments and which different industries could really look into to mitigate the increase of electricity system costs as they accommodate more renewables. And of course, vehicle to grid is not the only way for EVs to provide flexibility. We have also smart charging or a delayed charging through time of use tariffs, for example. Another opportunity is the growth of hydrogen. So storing energy through hydrogen. There are two ways of providing flexibility. One way would be to run electrolyzers, which would, for example, absorb the excess of variable renewable to produce hydrogen, which would then be stored and used later. And we see that the strong growth in hydrogen demand, especially in heavy industry for steelmaking, but also for long distance transport with ammonia for shipping or synthetic fuels for aviation, could contribute to make this profitable. It would also contribute to reduce the cost of hydrogen production, as we can imagine that in the future, periods during which we have an excess of variable generation, in those periods, the cost of electricity will be cheaper. So this is one opportunity, and the other is, of course, to invest in fuel cells that would produce electricity in a flexible manner to be able to meet, for example, peak demand or provide other services. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to the fourth mega trend we're seeing at the IEA, which is thermal storage. Why thermal storage? It's because thermal demand is set to drive the peak load. So we ranked all the hours of the year from the hours of low variable renewable generation to the hours of high variable renewable generation. We realized that for commercial cooling, there is no specific correlation between when we need the cooling and when we have variable renewables. But for residential, it's a completely different story because the peak occurs typically at periods when we have not a lot of solar not a lot of variable renewable generated in the grid. It's because we need cooling typically during hours of low generation. And there is a business opportunity to, of course, have a kind of thermal storage that would displace this extra capacity requirements throughout throughout other time scale where we'll have some renewable capacity in the grid. And this is a big deal because this is the example taken from China in 2030, and it could displace as much as 150 gigawatts of power. Thermal storage is not only about cooling, it's also about heating, of course. And here I'd like to draw your attention on power to heat, especially, and systems that could combine efficient heating production through heat pumps with storage through prototypes that are being developed in particular by the energy storage TCP, as Teun mentioned before. So here we can see that in 2050, in the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, more than 55% of total heat demand is produced by heat pumps. And to deploy heat pumps in different buildings, including in old buildings that are generally the least performers, we need to find advanced solutions to mitigate the impact of the heat pumps on the peak load through, for example, the integration of heat batteries in a compact and affordable product for the end user. Finally, we have power to heat through community-based systems, for example, through district energy. And we realized that the expansion of district energy could benefit from the expansion of renewables. The first reason is that thermal storage at the scale of a district is much more efficient, of course, because we can distribute and be connected to more buildings and more households and offices, but that it could also absorb some renewable that could be generated during a certain period of time and stored. This energy could be stored in the form of heat in different districts, and that therefore it could contribute to the integration of variable renewables while being decarbonized. Because today we have more than 90% of all the district heating which is produced by fossil fuels. And so through this means, this would not only allow a larger share of renewables in the mix, but also allow the decarbonization of district energy systems. Oops, sorry. So to conclude, I'd like to say that system solutions are the way to go. We can give different examples. The first one is related to the one I proposed I presented, sorry, on district energy systems, where we could have integrated electricity and heat networks acting together to optimize the different storage solutions that could be integrated at the buildings level, at the district level, or at the city level. Here you have an example from a smart district. You can have more information by clicking on the link here. Another example is the use of direct current microgrids, which could allow to respond more dynamically to different signals from directly the rooftop solar PV connected directly to the appliances or to storage devices at the district level. So at the conclusion, the share of variable renewables in the electricity mix at net zero emissions increases dramatically. We reach 70% at the global level, and at the country level, it's generally between 50 and 75%. It raises many challenges, and so we need to use the diversity of storage solutions to be able to meet all those challenges. And the use of energy storage technologies enables a more efficient use of resources and lowers the total system costs, and especially avoids investments in the upgrade of the electricity infrastructure. And last, integrated networks, for example, interconnected thermal and electric grids are essential to leverage on the widest diversity of solutions at disposal, all of them being connected to a single district, for example. Thank you for your attention. You can contact me if you have a further question at this address. But as of next month, we'll have a new IEA desk officer, which will be Amalia Pizarro. So welcome to Amalia, and I've put her email address here in case you have follow-up questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was also very nice to give the different view for the different solutions there are. We still have a couple of minutes time for questions. So if there's some, please raise your digital hand. Okay, I think not in a moment. Okay, so I used this minutes to ask a question myself. The thing you showed these different solutions, and in your opinion, do you think there is one of them which is not getting enough attention lately, or in the research or industry, or anywhere in the development?
I mean, yeah, I think especially what was given a lot of attention before is the use of interconnections and the upgrade of the electricity infrastructure through on-site batteries, which is a way to solve many problems, but which will lead, of course, to more costly solutions. On the contrary, what wasn't given so much attention is to take into account the forward-looking perspective, to try to understand how the energy demands will evolve, how the different applications will be in 2030, in 2040, so that we can design the energy storage solutions in the best way possible based on those trends. In particular, when I'm thinking of thermal storage, we had this comment before that we introduced hot water tanks, and this was really the result for me of the analysis of what is the energy demand pattern and how I could meet it more sustainably. Now we need to do this exercise, but on a totally different scale, because we need to look at all the energy system, because things are becoming interconnected, and the decarbonization of electricity is of course affecting many end users.
Okay, many thanks. I see there is another question in the chat from Sergei Peters, hope I pronounced it correctly. It's about the flexibility in electricity production with fuel cell stacks requires to add and use batteries besides the stack, because the fuel cell are difficult in modulating energy production. The fuel cell stacks are suited for low-level basic load, but not for highly flexible energy delivery. Did you take that into account when looking into flexibility?
So yes, so at the global level, we have a number of assumptions for each of the storage possibilities regarding the costs for implementation. So in the case of the fuel cell stacks, we of course need to take into account the fact that we need additional batteries, and we are trying to optimize the pool of solutions so that it could meet and ensure energy security for the level of viable renewables that we have in the grid, that we have in the generation mix. But after, we don't really have a high level overview about each of the solutions that are being taken. We are still at the stage where we say that energy storage would contribute to this much, for example, of meeting peak demand, but it's quite difficult for us at this stage to say that X% of it will be from, for example, fuel cells, and another Y% will be from another means. And so we are working right now with the energy storage TCP to try to better understand the constraints for each of the storage options, so that we could have more granularity in the recommendations we are providing.
Okay, many thanks. There is one more question, and I think for the sake of time, we will have this question afterwards. We can finish in time. Robert van Egmond, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, Thibaut, thank you for your talk. It was great. I have one question. You talked about all the houses with heat pumps and that there is a lot of electricity needed in wintertime, and that you are focusing on local in the dwelling heat storage. So how does this, do you take into consideration that you could also store, let's say, hydrogen or whatever, or make a lot of electricity centrally in the country to power all these heat pumps in wintertime? And what's the rationale to say between those two options?
Sorry, what is produced in a central manner? You mean heat or electricity?
Well, for the heat pumps, you need electricity. In the house, of course, you can produce or store heat to use in the, let's say, Dunkelflaute weeks. But centrally, you could produce or maybe store electricity or produce electricity in these periods of no wind and no solar.
Yes. So we looked increasingly at where the electricity is coming from, and we realized that actually to meet the demands of electricity, to meet the growing demand for electricity, we would need buildings to play an active role in their production. So we would need to leverage on the existing rooftop to install as many solar panels as possible and turn households not only as neutral energy buildings, but like to turn them as positive energy buildings to discharge electricity to the grid. And so most of the electricity that we see that are used to fuel the heat pumps is actually coming from from nearby, from the district themselves. We consider that it's the role of buildings to be able to supply for more electricity to the grid.
Yeah, sure. That I understand. But then in the wintertime, my building, I have a heat pump, but it needs a lot of electricity in the winter times when my solar panels do almost nothing. So at these times, we need the flexibility option, either from a heat storage in my house or more electricity from the net. So these two options that you have, produce centrally more electricity, or have a heat storage to overcome this flexibility period in the winter times. Did you compare those?
Yeah, we analyzed also the heat densities because it's a key factor to decide on where the storage is coming from. Typically, for very high density regions, we consider that the heat storage could come from nearby sources. So typically integrated solutions with district energy systems. And the heat, then the electricity would be produced, the heat would be produced locally through the electricity that would be produced elsewhere in a centralized manner. For lower density regions, it's a bit of the contrary. We would need to rely on more local resources for storage so that we could ensure less variability in the demand between the winter and the summertime. Of course, this depends also on the country because we're assuming here that the peak occurs in the winter time in your example. But of course, it will be the contrary for a developing region that would be hot and sunny in India or Indonesia, for example.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to conclude now. Thanks again to the speaker for your presentations and for us answering the questions. Just share my screen as well. So many thanks again. It was nice to have you here. I hope everyone enjoyed this first ES OnSeminar. The next seminar will be on the 17th of February, again at 14 o'clock CET. The next time the topic is the compact thermal energy storage materials and components. Speakers will be Andreas Hauer, which is the Task 40 manager. So this is the Task 40, by the way. And then there are the two subtask leaders, Stefania Doppio and Christoph Ratgeber, who will talk about this topic. Yeah, with this spoiler for the next time, I would like to finish the seminar, and I was very pleased that so many people were taking part, and many thanks again to the speaker, and I'm happy to see you next time.